Okay, were the BBC right to stand down Gary Lineker from presenting duties? Now, Match of the Day tonight, as I'm recording this video, will go to air with no presenter and no punditry team and no Match Day commentators, which will be a first ever. Because when they stood down Gary Lineker yesterday, and it was a very, well, the kerfuffle behind it, because they really didn't deal with it very well. They could have come out and stated he's not suspended, but he won't be presenting tomorrow night. Line in the sand. We've spoken to his colleagues to find a solution. Match today may not air tonight. They could have dealt with it more firmly, I think. He made his Twitter statement in regards to the UK government's policy on refugees and illegal immigration, which he doesn't agree with. A lot of people don't. Some people do agree with the government policy and how they're trying to tackle illegal immigration. Now, but a lot of people who actually support the government policy also support Gary Lineker for being able to be critical of the government because that's how freedom of speech works. But there's a thing, there's also consequences. You've got freedom of speech, however, there are consequences. Now, the BBC is a publicly funded broadcaster. The licence fee. Now, for those viewers who are outside of the UK, the licence fee is similar to a tax, but it isn't quite a tax, but it acts like a tax in how the BBC is funded. Partially. Some of its other funding comes from selling things overseas on BBC Prime, which is their commercial arm, which is how they make some revenue, but the majority of their income comes from the licence fee. Gary Lineker has to publicly, display his salary, basically. Alongside all the other presenters, he is the highest paid member of the BBC presenting team. Let that sink in. I don't think what he stated is controversial, however, impartiality bias. The BBC does state that its presenters must be impartial and have no bias. Clearly, he's showing a political bias about a situation, and that is their reasoning why he's been pulled. But here we go. I'm going to go back in time a little bit. Now, I've covered this on a video. The Dan Roan comments made outside the Leicester City Stadium following the helicopter crash, I think, were far more controversial, had racial undertones to them, was not sacked. Now, I was very passionate in that video. It's one of my least favourite videos I've ever made. It's the most popular video on the channel. The Dan Roan situation. His comments, off air, but caught on camera and on the microphone. There is audio and video of him making those comments. So he cannot deny that he said them. And it was a very charged, emotional moment. People had just died. And he was the nearest reporter. That he was meant to be reporting on the actual match that had taken place at the King Power Stadium. And it was just after full time, and the helicopter crashed, with the owner on board and some of his personal guests. Now, some of the statements that Dan Roan made were, well, inappropriate. It's a nice word. There were some racial undertones to them as well. Some people inferred that. He was not sacked or suspended by the BBC. He's still employed. He was withdrawn from frontline reporting for a few days, so he wasn't going to do any of the match day reports, going out to interview people following a game or before a game or in the press conferences. However, he was still allowed to write his column for the BBC website, and he was still allowed to conduct some investigative kind of journalism, like preparing for an article or preparing for an interview, that kind of thing. So he wasn't actually suspended at all. He just had some of his duties changed for a brief period. Never got in any trouble for it. Now, when I made that video back in 2018, I believe it was, I was a lot younger and I think a little, I wouldn't say naive, but I still had some of that bias, if you know what I mean. I tried to be as neutral and unbiased as possible. I still had some of that slight, too passionate, I think is the best way to describe it. And it's a very controversial video on the channel. It's got a lot of people with very mixed thoughts on that incident. In my opinion, my views haven't changed. I think the way I would discuss the incident would be different. But I do feel he should have been suspended. They've taken a bit of a stronger action with Gary Lineker, although I think the way they've handled it is a bit different. Although I think Gary Lineker hasn't technically been suspended, he's been stood down. Dan Roan wasn't technically stood down, he was stood back from frontline duties. He was allowed to work in the background. But then we go back a bit further. Ron Atkinson, Sky Sports. he made a racial slur about Marcel Desailly. He used racist language. He was promptly fired straight away. Similar incident to Dan Roan. Wasn't aware the microphone was still on and the cameras actually also caught video footage. He cannot deny that he said those things. Cannot deny it. It happened. Nearly 20 years ago. He hasn't appeared on a TV screen since. No other broadcaster, be it on radio or TV, wants to touch Ron Atkinson with a barge pole. At all. At all. He has not been on a television broadcast in this country for nearly 20 years. And that is quite a statement. Then we have Don Cherry over in Canada for Sportsnet on Hockey Night in Canada on Coach's Corner, his little segment in between periods of play during the match. Again, he made sort of a veiled comment, sort of a level below Ron Atkinson, but above, sort of equivalent to Dan Roan's comments in regards to the poppy and wearing the poppy on Remembrance Weekend and on the 11th of November. It's not enshrined in law that we have to wear it. Now, as the son of someone who did serve in the armed forces, as someone who's got friends and relatives in the armed forces right now, yes, I do support the British Legion. Yes, occasionally I wear my poppy if I'm out and about on Remembrance Sunday. I have wristbands, I have t-shirts and such. I've got the Help for Heroes stuff, but I don't always wear it in public. I've got little lapel pins. I've been given, but I don't always wear it in public. However, Don Cherry was making a reference towards people of left-leaning political persuasions and the immigrant community and the younger generation who may not understand the significance of Remembrance Day to older generations and to the culture and history of the British Commonwealth. He was fired by Sportsnet because they felt there was racist and anti-immigrant undertones to what he was saying. And Don Cherry had been controversial in the past. Now, Gary Lineker, with his Twitter usage, has irked the BBC's hierarchy in the past. But you can see the inconsistency here, be it an overseas broadcaster straight away for something I wouldn't say was the most serious thing. I think Don Cherry, though, had overstayed his welcome. He was in his 80s. I mean, he's of a certain generation. He maybe should have retired a few years prior. The people in charge of Sportsnet felt they had to act, which is Rogers, which is a big, massive broadcasting network in Canada. They felt they had to act. One too many controversies. Okay, advertisers could start pulling their advertising revenue from our platform, which will cost us income. The Ron Atkinson, Sky Sports, same thing, except there is no defending that at all. And again, it's a commercial broadcaster, relying on subscriptions, but also relying on advertising revenue. And not all the Sky channels are behind the subscription paywall. So if the advertisers go, we're not going to advertise on your network unless, because you haven't dealt with this sufficiently enough or too many of these negative incidents are happening, that's going to affect the bottom line financially. Then we go back in time to the late 80s and the early 90s, because there's two separate incidents involving this journalist, and that's Frank Bough. Many people overseas won't know who Frank Bough is, and many people who are younger than me will not have a clue who Frank Bough is. So if you're younger than the age of 25, maybe 30, you may not know who Frank Bough is. There's a reason for that. He's now passed away, sadly. But he got caught in two separate awkward situations with women that weren't his wife. Later transpired he was having several extramarital affairs with many women, but he was seen as the family face of Grandstand. Now, Grandstand for the younger generation was a major multi-sport program on the BBC. It was your staple Saturday viewing. You would have the horse racing at Royal Ascot, for example. You might go to the F1 at whether it was Donington or Silverstone for the British Grand Prix. Then you might go for the Grand Prix motorcycle racing, and then you might have the British touring cars on there. Final Score, Football Focus. There were multiple sports, Five Nations match, because Grandstand went into the Six Nations era rugby union, but didn't quite. Challenge Cup, Rugby League. There'll be multiple different sports broadcasts. Frank Bough was the main presenter in the BBC studios in London. In the late 80s, he was caught with a lady of the night who wasn't his wife and some Class A drugs. So the BBC were a bit embarrassed by this. He then went over to what would become ITV for a brief stint. The same thing happened again. He never really recovered following the allegations about his private life. Now, technically, being in possession of a controlled substance is a crime, but consumption is not. Now, these were all allegations that sort of surfaced in the tabloid media. The BBC panicked a little bit, as did ITV, and they sort of like tried to get round it. It was very damaging. He was withdrawn from Grandstand. He had a reduced role on BBC. Then he went over to what became ITV. Same thing happened again. Again, further allegations about his private life and extramarital affairs and use of call girls and drugs. And he basically sort of got binned off. What we then found out was he was known as a bit of a sex pest. Yeah, he was known as a womanizer. Following his departure from mainstream media. But he wasn't technically fired, they just didn't renew his contract. But he never really gained a high-profile role again. So, when we're talking about Gary Lineker and controversy, he's not controversial at all. Have the BBC overreacted? Well, here's the thing. Since the Dan Roan incident, I think we've become more polarised. And I think the BBC is under pressure because less people are willing to pay the licence fee. Gary Lineker is the highest paid presenter on their books, massive salary. And it's becoming more controversial than it needs to be. Now, the BBC have basically said they want to keep Gary Lineker on Match of the Day and further live football broadcasts, for example, like the FA Cup final or the Euros, the Women's World Cup, things like that. They want to keep Gary Lineker around. They don't want to fire him. They want to get the boundaries right of what is acceptable social media use and what isn't, because there's that impartiality clause that is in every BBC contract. If he was a presenter on ITV or Channel 5, because Channel 4 has partial funding from the licence fee, if he was a broadcaster on Channel 5 or ITV, I don't think we have this same kind of controversy. If anything, that might boost the interest in the programme he would be presenting and boost their viewership, because he's been controversial. I would say the BBC technically under contract, they have to. I think the way they've handled the situation has been a shambles. I think Gary Lineker hasn't helped himself by his continual attacks on the British government on his social media pages. He's been highly critical for a long, long time. But he was highly critical about the Qatar World Cup, yet he still was happy to go and broadcast there. So it's there's some hypocrisy, there's some double-edged sword. I don't think what he's done is controversial. I think he's well within his rights to do so, and a lot of people, even people who don't necessarily agree with his viewpoints, are agreeing with his right to freedom of speech. But there's also with freedom of speech becomes the consequences of. Now, as I say, far less controversial than everyone else I mentioned on this incident. Don Cherry and Dan Roan, I can sort of put a level par, maybe. Yeah. But one got sacked, one's still working. The incident involving Frank Bough, well, that's just hilarious, isn't it, really? But it isn't. But it's the way it was dealt with. And there seems to be an inconsistency. And there seems to be reactionary motion here. Dan Roan, I don't think the BBC reacted strong enough with Dan Roan. With Gary Lineker, I think they're acting too strongly. But there we go. Place your thoughts in the comments section below. My views are up in the air on this. Yeah, Gary Lineker, I think, has been, told before, you just be careful with the social media because it may be construed in the wrong way. But I think the BBC have overreacted. But then looking at the Dan Roan situation, the Ron Atkinson situation, Don Cherry, you've got to remember the BBC is publicly funded. Don Cherry and Ron Atkinson were on commercial broadcasters. They've got to protect their own integrity and their own bottom line. Frank Bough, well, that is the example I use because technically his career never recovered up until the day he died. It never recovered. He never got back to the same status as a top-level broadcaster following those two incidents. So we shall see what happens. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts in the comments section below, and I'll have some more content for you very, very soon.